Tonight, you'll throw something away without thinking twice. A chicken bone, a fish skeleton, the gristly end of a steak you didn't finish. It takes you less than a second to toss it in the bin. But for merely the entire span of human existence, that single bone would have been treated like treasure. Not eaten, not discarded, kept. Your ancestors didn't waste bone. They couldn't afford to. And the reason why says something uncomfortable about the world you live in now. Picture a small band of early humans, maybe 20 of them, moving across a cold grassland 60,000 years ago. They've just brought down an animal, a wild ancestor of today's cattle, after days of tracking and hours of exhausting pursuit. The meat gets stripped first. That part is obvious. But watch what happens next. Someone kneels beside the carcass and starts cracking the long bones open, one by one, with a fist-sized stone. Why? Marrow. The soft, fatty tissue packed inside the shaft of a large bone is one of the most calorie-dense substances available in nature. Anthropologist Henry Bunn, who spent years studying butchery marks on ancient animal remains in East Africa, found something striking. Early hominins weren't just eating the easy parts of a kill. They were going after the bones that other predators left behind, the femurs and tibias that hyenas and lions couldn't crack open with their own jaws. Marrow was a resource only accessible to a creature clever enough to use tools. That single insight changes how you should picture your ancestors, not as brute survivors grabbing whatever was closest, as calculating specialists, extracting nutrition that stronger, faster animals physically could not reach. But marrow was only the beginning. Once the fat and protein were gone, the bone itself still had a job to do. A rib, sharpened patiently against stone, became an awl for punching holes through hide. A long leg bone, split lengthwise, became a blade for scraping fat off animal skins so they wouldn't rot. Smaller fragments were shaped into needles so fine that archaeologists have found eyed bone needles over 40,000 years old, tiny enough to thread with sinew. Think about that for a moment. A needle, made from something you'd call garbage. Every part had a second life, and a third. Antler became harpoon points, shoulder blades became crude shovels. Even the ash left from burning bone marrow for fuel had a purpose, mixed into the ground to help preserve other materials nearby. Nothing sat idle. Nothing was excess. Here's the question worth sitting with. Why does this matter to you, someone who has never once worried about where your next meal is coming from? Because the instinct that made your ancestors save every bone hasn't disappeared. It just lost its target. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent decades studying how the human mind handles scarcity, gain, and loss. One of his central findings was that people feel the pain of losing something far more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. Economists call this loss aversion. But zoom out far enough, and it starts to look like an inherited survival reflex. A brain shaped by tens of thousands of years, where losing a resource, any resource, could mean the difference between eating next week and starving, is not a brain that forgets easily. It's a brain wired to hoard, to reuse, to squeeze every last bit of value from what it already has. Your ancestors weren't being frugal out of virtue. They were being frugal because the alternative was death. And that wiring is still running underneath everything you do, even now, even in a world stacked with more surplus than any human generation in history has ever seen. Think about the last time you kept a broken phone charger in a drawer for no reason, or refused to throw out a jar because it might be useful someday. Or felt a small flash of guilt scraping food into the trash. That flicker of discomfort isn't random, it's ancient. It's the same neural circuitry that once made a shattered leg bone feel too valuable to leave behind on the savanna. But here's the twist most people never consider. This instinct wasn't just about survival. It was about identity. Archaeologist Rebecca Ragg Sykes, who has spent much of her career studying Neanderthal life through the objects they left behind, points out that tool use went far beyond function. The specific way a community shaped their bone tools, the patterns etched into an antler handle, the particular curve of a scraper's edge, these things carried meaning. They marked a group as belonging to a specific place, a specific set of traditions, a specific way of seeing the world. In other words, what your ancestors made from a carcass wasn't only about staying alive, it was about who they were. You do the same thing today, whether you notice it or not. The brand of knife in your kitchen, the particular way your family folds a sandwich, the tools you refuse to replace because they feel like an extension of you. That impulse to imbue an object with more than its function, to let it carry a piece of your identity, didn't start with modern culture. It started with a hand-worked bone tool 40,000 years before anyone thought to call it craftsmanship. Now here's where it gets stranger. You'd expect that once agriculture arrived, once humans started farming and stockpiling grain instead of hunting, this bone conservation instinct would fade. Surplus, after all, should loosen the grip of scarcity thinking. It didn't. If anything, some of history's most elaborate bone-based economies appear after farming took hold. Tanning industries built entire trades around bone tools for scraping leather. Bone became buttons, dice, dominoes, sewing implements, even early musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bone with finger holes precisely spaced to produce a scale. A resource born from necessity became a foundation for craft, commerce, art, and play. Scarcity created the habit. Abundance didn't erase it. Abundance just gave the habit somewhere new to go. Which brings you back to that bone on your plate tonight. You don't need the marrow. You don't need the awl, the needle, the scraper. You have a supermarket 10 minutes away and a drawer full of steel tools that never dull. The pressure that shaped this behavior in your ancestors is gone, but the behavior itself is still tucked somewhere inside you, waiting for a use it will probably never get. That twinge you feel throwing something away that still has some use left in it. That satisfaction from repairing instead of replacing. That strange comfort in an object that's been with you a long time, worn down, reshaped by use, exactly the way a bone tool would be reshaped after years in someone's hand. You are not wasteful by nature. You were built over hundreds of thousands of years by people who could not afford to be. And tonight, when the sun goes down and you scrape your plate into the trash without a second thought, some quiet, ancient part of you will still remember when that single bone was never garbage at all. It was everything.